The date is March 31st, 1878, and in the small town of Galveston, Texas, a giant of the boxing world would be born to two former slaves. He would refuse to play by the rules of the establishment, which tried its hardest to ensure that he wouldn't be champion. This defiance and bravery paved the way for many colored fighters who would follow him. Touted as the greatest fighter to ever live by Muhammad Ali, his name was Jack Johnson. Growing up in the South during the Jim Crow era, Jack faced his fair share of discrimination. This wasn't helped by the fact that he was quite small in stature as a child. He attended school for 5 years until he quit to work at the local dock, and this gruelingly hard work began to shape the body of this one-day champion. Finding steady employment hard to come by, eventually, Jack would move to the much larger city of Dallas. He would eventually take up an apprenticeship as a carriage painter under one Walter Lewis. Lewis was an avid boxing fan, and through Lewis, Jack would be introduced to the world of prize fighting. Johnson would state that, had it not been for meeting Lewis, he likely never would have been a boxer. Setting his sights on the mecca of boxing, Johnson would move to New York City in 1894. He would become close friends and roommates with future welterweight champion Barbados Joe Walcott. When not working, Johnson would spend his time practicing boxing techniques anywhere he could learn them. This was a time of rapid evolution in the sport, where the old sturdy, man-to-man style of boxing was beginning to look more like a style of the past, as many new, slicker, quicker, and more versatile styles of boxing began to emerge, in large part thanks to the growing prominence of black boxers who had formerly only been allowed to compete in unsanctioned and illegal bouts. His time in the Big Apple was not to last, however, as during the 1890s, following decades of rapid growth in a booming economy, Wall Street would see two major panics, and jobs became harder to come by. Because of this, Jack would move back to Galveston, where he would find employment as a janitor at a gym, which just so happened to be owned by heavyweight boxer Herman Bernal. It seemed as though Jack was fated for fisticuffs. After fighting in various illegal prize fighting circuits, Johnson would make his professional debut on November 1st, 1898, in his hometown. He would take on Charlie Brooks for the state middleweight title. He would knock out Brooks in 2 rounds. Johnson began to get noticed for his speed and athleticism, and in 1899, Jack would travel to Chicago to fight the black Herculean boxer known only as Klondike. In their 6th-round contest, Jack would be stopped in the 5th round by the brutally strong Black Hercules. After this defeat, Jack began to reflect on whether or not relying on his raw strength and power were the best path to success. And he began to adapt the quick, slick, rolling style that many of the smaller boxers were showing with prominence. A couple of years had passed, and Jack, having fought consistently in both unsanctioned and sanctioned bouts, would take on his toughest challenge yet, the crafty veteran, Joe Chowinski. He would lose by knockout. Chowinski was a popular and experienced heavyweight, and Johnson lasted just 3 rounds. Prize fighting was illegal in Texas at the time, and both men were arrested after the fight. Bail was set at $5,000, a massive amount at the time, which neither man could afford. The sheriff permitted both fighters to go home at night, so long as they agreed to spar in the jail cell. Large crowds gathered to watch the sessions, and after 23 days in jail, their bail was reduced to an affordable level, and the grand jury refused to indict either man. However, Johnson later stated that he sharpened his boxing skills to a major level during that time in jail. Chowinski saw natural talent and determination in Johnson, and taught him the nuances of defense, stating to him, "A man who can move like you should never take a punch." The two would remain lifelong friends. With this newfound guidance, Jack would continue to climb the ranks, and by 1903, he had amassed over 50 fights, winning most of them, and in that same year he would challenge Denver Ed Martin for the World Colored Heavyweight Championship, an official title in boxing at the time. Johnson would thoroughly outbox Martin over 20 rounds and claim the title, but this would not sate his desire for the seemingly unattainable world title carried by James J. Jeffries. Johnson would defend the color title 17 times against many notable fighters of the day, including Sam McVeigh, Sam Langford, and Joe Jeanette. During this time, Jack's wish to capture the world title became an obsession, and seeing no path through the conventional means, Jack began to pursue the fight camps of Jeffries, openly taunting him at every chance he could. Though frustrated, the powers that be of the boxing world refused to give Johnson a shot. They feared the various implications should the colored fighter come out on top. James Jeffries would retire as champion in 1905, never having fought a colored fighter during his reign. When Marvin Hart and Jack Root were billed to vie for the vacated title, Johnson was infuriated. He wasn't even considered. It seemed to Jack that no matter what he did, a shot at the world title would stay out of his reach. Many in the boxing world, a reflection of racial attitudes at the time, still felt that colored fighters just weren't in league with their white counterparts. This view would be shattered when Johnson would take on former world champion Bob Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons was a highly respected champion and was considered a great at the time. He had given Jeffries all he could handle in the contest that they had, and Jack would demolish him in just 2 rounds. Johnson's abilities at this point were simply undeniable. The title would eventually pass to Canadian Tommy Burns, and Johnson would resume his taunting tours, following Burns on his fight camps wherever he could, taunting him just as he had Jeffries. Finally, after being guaranteed a purse of $30,000, nearly $1 million today adjusting for inflation, Burns agreed to the match. It would be held in Australia, with the world watching close to see if Burns could finally shut up the loudmouth Johnson. This was not to pass, as Jack would make easy work of Tommy, playing with him for 14 rounds before the police intervened, saving Burns from taking further damage. After the fight, many racial tensions brewed in the US. Even before the fight, the New York Times wrote of the event. If the black man wins, thousands and thousands of his ignorant brothers will misinterpret his victory as justifying claims to being much more than physically equal with their white neighbors, and some began to dream of a great white hope who could dethrone Johnson. Several men would try, including middleweight champion Stanley Ketchel, and all of them would fail. This frustrated many in the boxing world, hoping for another white superstar to emerge in the heavyweight division. The year was 1910, and 2 years into Johnson's reign, the public is beginning to lose interest in boxing. It seemed as though the majority of Americans just weren't interested in watching Johnson dominate everybody he fought. The public was clamoring for Jeffries to come out of retirement, but it seemed as though Jeffries, having gained 150 pounds in his retirement, had no plans on returning. This was until Tex Rickard offered Jeffries $120,000 to come out of retirement, $3.2 million adjusting for inflation. This size of purse was unheard of at the time, and Jeffries couldn't resist. Gambling around the event had seen some records being smashed. Not since the days of John L. had the public shown this much excitement for a prize fight. The contest took place on the 4th of July 1910, in front of 20,000 fans, at a ring built just for the occasion in downtown Reno, Nevada. Jeffries came out in his typical plodding and reaching stance, waiting for Jack to slip up so he could punish him with his career-defining power. He was, however, unable to impose his will on the younger champion, and Jack's speed proved to be too much. He would dominate the fight, and by the 15th round, after Jeffries had been knocked down twice, a first in his career, his corner threw in the towel to end the fight and prevent Jeffries from taking further punishment. Jack later remarked that he knew the fight was over after the 4th round when he landed an uppercut, and he saw the look on Jeffries' face, stating, "I knew what that look meant. The old ship was sinking." Afterwards, Jeffries was humbled by the loss and what he'd seen of Johnson in their match. He stated, "I could never have whipped Johnson at my best." Jeffries said, "I couldn't have hit him, no. I couldn't have reached him in 1,000 years." This humility impressed Johnson, and the two would become friends after the fight. The fight of the century, as it was billed, had earned Johnson $65,000 and silenced the critics. They believed Johnson's previous victory over Tommy Burns was empty, claiming that Burns was a false champion since he had never defeated Jeffries. Even John L. Sullivan, a fervent supporter of Jeffries, stated after the fight that Johnson won deservedly, fairly, and convincingly. The aftermath of the contest caused race riots all over the country. It's worth noting that the fight took place on the American Day of Independence, and many publications were marketing the bout as the return of the Great White Champion, further antagonizing racial tensions in a country still living under Jim Crow laws in the South. Not all were rioting, however. African Americans were jubilant and celebrated Jack's great victory as a victory for racial advancement. Black poet William Warren Cunny later highlighted the black reaction to his fight in his poem, "My Lord, What a Morning." "Oh my Lord, what a morning. Oh my Lord, what a feeling, when Jack Johnson turned Jim Jeffries' snow-white face up to the ceiling. Yes, my lord, fighting is wrong, but what an uppercut. Oh my Lord, what a morning. Oh my Lord, what a feeling, when Jack Johnson turned Jim Jeffries' lily-white face up to the ceiling. Oh my Lord, what a morning. Oh my Lord, take care of Jack. Keep him, Lord, as you made him, big, strong, and black." Around the country, blacks held spontaneous parades and gathered in prayer meetings. In all, riots occurred in more than 25 states and 50 cities. At least 20 people were killed as a result. As champion, Jack would begin to lose favor among blacks across America. The color bar remained in force even under him. Once he was the world's heavyweight champion, Jack did not fight a black opponent for the first 5 years of his reign. He denied matches to black heavyweights Joe Jeanette, Sam Langford, and the young and up-and-coming Harry Willis, who was the world's color champion at the time. Jack would reason that there was simply more money in fighting white challengers. In his personal life, Jack engaged in various relationships, including 3 documented marriages. All of his wives were white. He met his first wife, Etta, a Brooklyn socialite, at a car race in 1909. The relationship was rocky from the get-go. In 1910, Jack hired a private investigator to follow her after suspecting that she was having an affair with his chauffeur. On Christmas Day, Jack confronted her and beat her so badly she was hospitalized. They reconciled and eventually were married in January 1911. Prone to depression, her condition worsened, in part due to Johnson's abuse and infidelity. She committed suicide in September 1912, shooting herself. And just 3 months later, Jack would marry his second wife, Lucille Cameron. This was one of the most controversial events of his career, and that was a career filled with controversies. He was arrested on the grounds that his relationship with Lucille violated the Mann Act against transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes, due to her being an alleged prostitute. Her mother also swore that she was insane. Cameron refused to cooperate, and the case fell apart. Less than a month later, Jack was arrested again on similar charges. This time, the woman, another alleged prostitute named Belle Schreiber, with whom he had been involved with in 1909 and 1910, testified against him. This was all despite the fact that the incidents that were used to convict him were all committed before the passing of the Mann Act. He was sentenced by an all-white jury to a year and a day in prison. Jack, ever rebellious, would not cooperate, and he skipped bail. He left the country, joining Lucille in Montreal on June 25th before fleeing to France. To flee to Canada, Jack posed as a member of a black baseball team. For the next 7 years, Johnson would defend his championship only on foreign soil, evading U.S. authorities. He lived in exile in Europe, South America, and Mexico. Johnson would eventually return to the U.S. on July 20th, 1920. He surrendered to federal agents at the Mexican border and would serve a sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, where he would remain active as a boxer while serving his time. He was released on the 9th of July, 1921. At last, Jack could finally live in America again. Rewinding to 1915, now 39 years old, Jack was beginning to show his age. Ever the lover of the extravagant, his loss of focus began to renew the idea of a great white hope, and on April 15th of that year, he lost his title to Jess Willard, a working cowboy from Kansas who only started boxing when he was 27. With a crowd of 25,000 at the Oriental Park racetrack in Havana, Cuba, Johnson was knocked out in the 26th round of the scheduled 45-round fight. Although comfortably winning, the 45-round fight coupled with the hot Havana sun proved to be too much, and by the 20th round he began to visibly tire, being worn down by Willard's heavy body punches. After losing the championship, Jack would continue boxing but would never again contend at the highest levels of the sport. Many state that after losing his title, Jack was unmotivated and merely fought to make a living. His last fight was on September 1st, 1938. He was 62 years old. This was not the last time that Jack would step in the ring, as he would return for 2 more exhibition bouts, one against his old rival Joe Jeanette. This was to raise money for war bonds after the conclusion of the Second World War. A year later, on June 10th, 1946, Jack would die in a car crash on the U.S. Highway 1 near Franklinton, North Carolina, after racing angrily from a diner that refused to serve him. He was 68 years old at the time of his death. He was buried at the Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, and his grave was initially unmarked. This was changed in 2005, and the stone now reads, Jack Johnson, first black heavyweight champion of the world. Johnson's signature is on the back of the stone. A man who rose to every challenge and stuck his nose up to a world that did not wish to have him, Jack Johnson's courage and gusto is something to truly be admired. May his spirit and memory inspire all those who are told not to follow their dreams, whether it be boxing or otherwise. Rest in peace, Jack Arthur Johnson.
Jack Johnson. It was so long ago, people still had log cabins in this country, and they rode horses and wagons and stagecoaches to fight. He was one black man in the midst of all them rednecks would kill lynch Negroes every day. He would dress up in pretty suits. Negroes are allowed to dress up in days. He put on pretty white neckties and pretty white, and had white women. You know that nigga was bold. He married white women. You would get lynched for looking at a white woman in them days. That man married white women and walked around, took pictures with his white women, married 2 of them, and they even run him out of the country because of white woman. He left the whole country and fought out of Cuba. He was bad. Back in 1909, man. Man, you know, Jack Johnson was the greatest. He had to be the greatest of all. Wasn't no Black Panthers, wasn't no bodyguards, white people, lynching niggas, wasn't no television, wasn't no telephone. And that Negro was doing all this stuff in them days. He was bad when you think about it. I know I'm bad, but he was crazy.